Oh, bears, the fluffy tanks, the big sponge. You finally have some more druid things baseline to make you feel like a druid. Cyclone, Ferocious Bite that no longer needs to be talented, a shorter cooldown on your major defensive abilities, and Berserk baseline makes Guardian a bit more impactful in Shadowlands. That plus some talent changes, legendaries, and some surprising Covenant ability effects make Bear more fun than it has been in years. So let's check it out. Now before you check out our stream, because segue. But really now, we stream 5 days a week normally, and we dabble into a lot of classes and specs both in Shadowlands and BFA as time permits. Go to twitch.tv/MarcelianOnline for our schedule, since we do have a varied schedule in the hopes of catching you lot at a good time, maybe? Love you US folk and Aussies, but god damn, you live worlds apart. So let's check what's baseline for bears. I did mention Cyclone not needing a talent, a PvP one at least, in recent years. Although the utility can be strong if it becomes a thing in Mythic Plus, as a tank you will have few chances to use this at least consistently. Same with Ferocious Bite. Although if you raid, you know tanks will occasionally swap, so when you are off tanking coupled with some feral talents, you might actually be able to output some decent damage by shifting to cat and doing things. The good old druid mechanics. Missed ya. Major cooldowns have been addressed on top of it all. Berserk found its way into the Bear toolkit, a 3-minute cooldown that lasts for 15 seconds and reduces the cooldown of Mangle, Thrash, and Growl by 75%. It also reduces the cost of Iron Fur by 50%, which is probably the best defensive effect here. I was getting 6 to 8 stacks of Iron Fur pretty easily compared to live. This with limited haste and a very basic gear template. Same thing goes for the big 2 defensive cooldowns. Bark Skin now is a 1-minute cooldown that gives you 20% damage reduction for 12 seconds. This essentially ensures it's up for almost every strong boss attack that could potentially be a tank buster. In dungeons, you have it almost every pack, definitely every hard pack. Survival Instincts also got shaved down to a 3-minute recharge with 2 charges from 4 minutes. From an average perspective, you could say that you have a 50% damage reduction every 1.5 minutes that can stack with Bark Skin, so in terms of cooldowns, these should do the job. Is this enough though? Bears still have nothing when going into a new pack outside popping a very early Bark Skin. It's more available now with its cooldown being lower, but it still feels clunky and counterintuitive. Kindred Spirits from the Kyrians has been updated a few times and is now in a pretty interesting state. This ability pairs you up with the target for 1 minute. You cannot recast it on another target without right-clicking the buff on you, so maybe they'll add something to make this more intuitive. When you pair with someone, each one of you gets a buff based on the other's roll. As a tank, you soak up to 40% of the damage they take, this being the buff your target would receive. If your target is a DPS class, you gain 30% of their damage as additional damage or absorption. This is peculiar. I was getting absorb shields and I was doing more damage, but I'm still not sure how the mechanic of this effect is calculated or is supposed to work. The effect is nice though, and when you pair with a healer, part of their heals go to you, sort of like a beacon of life from Holy Paladins. You can get any of these buffs for 10 seconds at a time with a 1-minute cooldown, but the pairing with your partner remains. Adaptive Swarm is maybe one of the least impactful on the list. The Necrolords bless you with the power to empower the power of dots and hots. Aha! This is a buff or a debuff depending on who you cast it on, and after it expires, jumps to another target, friendly or hostile. The damage profile of bears is not that great to be paired with this one. You can play Galactic Guardian and spam Moonfires, I guess. You can also cast it on you and instantly pop a Frenzy regen for a massive Frenzy regen. But these conditions are too steep and reduce the overall effectiveness of this ability, since the value of it comes from its very low cooldown and the fact that you can have multiple out at the same time. Its effects are good. The only question is, how good are they? Moving on to the Night Fae, as luck would have it, the obtaining the ability is bugged on the beta, so as of this recording, I was not able to test it in dungeons, but the effect is still well known. Convoke the Spirits is a 4-second channel that spams 16 druid spells with a tendency to favor your current spec and form. The spells are casted from a restricted pool of Mangle, Ironfur, Moonfire, Wrath, Regrowth, Rejuvenation, Rake, and Thrash. It will favor Ironfurs and Mangles and Thrashes, but I noticed a Rejuve and a Regrowth here and there. This looks to be the best option for dungeons or essentially burst damage to pick up aggro. I don't know if it favors Thrash over Mangle in AoE and vice versa, but at this rate it sounds a bit too picky. From spamming Moonfires and Rakes to actually casting the spells you need is a big leap, and removing all the RNG factor will make it something you feel you need to manage, and that will turn it into a clunky ability. Since you can generate more than max range, but you cannot consume it midway or you break the channel because it's still a channel, although they did make it usable while moving, so yay for feedback. I'm not too sure about on that one. Ravenous Frenzy from the Venthyr is the last one and maybe the best offensive one yet. At least one that's not RNG. You pop it, and for 20 seconds, every druid spell you cast increases your damage, healing, and haste by 2%, stacking. If you stay idle for 1.5 seconds, aka not cast anything for a full global, you lose the buff, get stunned for 1 second, and damaged for 3% of your max health per stack of the buff accumulated. If you get CC'd by external sources, though it will not count as you being idle, so that's pretty good actually. Pair this up with Berserk and any Thrash legendary and your damage will be pretty swole. It's on a 3-minute cooldown, and for Bear it seems it has more AoE value than single target value, but hey, if you like vampires and ball dances, you won't feel bad for getting this baby as well. A few basic changes happened in the talents. Brambles has been nerfed to deal its bark skin damage effect every 5 and so seconds instead of 1 second, and Renewal made its way into the kit to replace Mark of Ursal. That gives bearers a healing cooldown to replace Wild Charge. Mighty Bash is now a 1-minute cooldown up from 45 seconds, which is like, why? A PvP change, since in PV the talent was rarely picked. And with that, the affinities have been changed. Each brings its own CC and /or utility ability. Balance comes with Typhoon, which may be the most impactful one for Bear. Now, you cannot have the healing from Resto Affinity and Typhoon, not to mention that Ursal's Vortex is now part of the Restoration Affinity. The value between Vortex and Typhoon is debatable, since one knocks stuff back, interrupting whatever they are doing, while the other keeps shit in place so you can kite. I guess having to choose between the two makes for a more compelling talent row. Feral Affinity comes with Maim, since Ferocious Bite is baseline. This might see play in raids when you are off-tanking, since the passive move speed cannot outweigh the healing and overall CC options from the other two talent options. This is on one talent row, goddamn. To replace Typhoon comes Heart of the Wild, the most druid thing in the druid world. I missed this gameplay. A lot actually. Heart of the Wild is a massive cooldown that empowers your chosen affinity for 45 seconds. As a bear, it will be pretty hard for you to swap out of bear and make use of this unless someone else can tank for you or things don't need to be tanked. This is a very tight niche, but one that can really make a difference if you have this talent equipped. I tested it with Resto Affinity, and casting an empowered Wild Growth with a few other HUDs can really bring your party up during an intermission or when the boss casts shit and you don't physically have to tank for a few seconds. I can see this working amazingly with Feral, maybe even Balance Affinity in raids when your tank taunts away for a prolonged time and you don't have anything to do. That's rarely the case and usually is a design flaw, but if your co-tank can take the heat or if you are just needed for a few taunt swaps, this can come in handy. Incarnation Guardian of Ursak is another cooldown that was changed. This time it will replace Berserk as it does with the other two DPS specs. It will increase your health by 30% and make Mangle hit up to 3 targets and last for 30 seconds, on top of the other effects Berserk already had. The HP gain is actually a big upgrade. With Iron Fur, bears capped the armor cap fairly easily, and even if you don't get armor cap, you have way more armor than usually you will need, and the real issue can be magic damage, which raw HP has always been one of the ways Blizzard allowed tanks to deal with it. Not to mention that raw HP is good everywhere. Incarnation is essentially Berserk but with an upgraded software and no filler apps. Lastly, Pulverize is the big change on the last row. Now you will have a 30-second cooldown on it and have it last for 10 seconds, but it will give you 20% damage reduction from your target at the cost of 2 charges of Thrash. 20% damage reduction every 30 seconds is essentially a single target bark skin. This is shaping up to be the raid/boss defensive option on the row, which has been a weird and dead row for years since Legion, cause Rend and Tear was offensively and defensively better in all aspects as an AoE talent and even in single target as an AoE talent. Did I mention this is an AoE talent used in single target? I guess I did once or twice. And all of this compared to Pulverize, which pretty much did nothing. Not until now. Fine. Although not all legendaries were working properly, I was able to have fun with a few that stood out. One of the new ones, like Kara's Fleeting Glimpse. This baby casts a spell every 45 seconds based on the form you will be in at that exact time. A Wild Growth if you are in caster form, Primal Wrath in cat, Starfall in Moonkin, Stampeding Roar in travel, and Barkskin in bear. The default is clearly Barkskin, and having a free Barkskin every 45 seconds is pretty neat. The real cool part is when you can track the timer and shift into Moonkin for that AoE Starfall. I wasn't using the Wikara for it, but can see this doing cool things with a proper setup. The Legion legendary effect, Lufa's Wrappings, made its way here and so far seems to be similar in effect. Thrash has 20% more damage and 30% more radius and can stack one more time. This is fairly straightforward and can work wonders with Berserk and Ravenous Frenzy when in a heavy AoE scenario. Not much else to say here. The synergies are all there and you can think of it as a Twisting Claws Azurite trait, I assume, where you prioritize casting it on cooldown, Thrash that is. Other than that, let's wait for conduits. Legacy of the Sleeper is the old artifact ability from Legion, but not really. It still makes you immune to CC, but this time grants you 25% more damage and 15% leech. All of these baked into Berserk as a cooldown, so it's tied to a 3-minute cooldown. This can be a bit awkward, as it always is when DPS cooldowns are paired with defensive ones. You want more damage, but you also want to save it for a shit situation when you will take more damage. Likely this will turn into a I need a defensive to survive and oh, I also deal more damage. The CC part is actually the coolest thing about it and can clearly outshine the DPS part to make you want to use it defensively always. Lastly, Druid Guardian Runecarve 2. Druid Guardian Runecarve. Druid. Damn it, man! Name your legendaries. You are stealing all my momentum. This yet to be named power makes Barkskin stronger by adding 15% more damage reduction. What? I mean, that actually matters a whole lot. A 1-minute cooldown, 35% damage reduction is nuts. On top of it, when you pop Barkskin, you also cast an Iron Fur and Frenzy regen. It's supposed to cast these at the end of its effect, but right now seems to not work. The tooltip does say at the beginning or end when in bear form, but it always did it at the beginning, which is better if we had to choose anyway. Casting 2 main mitigations at its end sounds counterintuitive and hardly can plan for it, since the purpose of it is to prevent damage taken, hence prevent the need of mitigation. That doesn't mean that it won't be useful, and one could argue that an Iron Fur on top of Barkskin might have less value than an Iron Fur just as Barkskin faded. Bears and druids in general still don't have conduits as of this recording, and so far, testing so many other specs, conduits seem like the big power gains in Shadowlands. Bigger than Covenant abilities, to be fair, which makes Covenants less impactful, with conduits taking the cake. Yay? Until you get to conduits, you need to select your Soulbind. Each Covenant has 3 so far, with more to be added in the future patches. Some of the options are quality of life, other world benefits, with 2 or 3 actually having an impact on your gameplay both in PvE and PvP. Pelagos from the Kyrians has a bunch of file buffs. To the little owl dude, Lego of the Past might be the most impactful one for you as a bear, where you get a stacking versatility buff as long as you don't cast the same ability twice, up to 5% versatility. This is a maintain type buff, but doesn't seem to be hard to keep up unless you just want to spam swipes for 12 seconds. Combat Meditation gives you a mastery buff as you use Kindred Spirits for the first time, so not the buff activating part? Ew. With a collect orbs mechanic to extend its duration. Mastery is decent, but was most of the time secondary to versatility anyway. Kalaya focuses more on crit and transforming your crits into group-wide heals with Valiant Strikes and other options down the talent tree. Probably not a big focus for Bear unless dodge becomes Biss again, although Cleansing Rites looks pretty dope, kind of like a resounding protection as right trait. Mechanicos seems to focus on mechanics that happen when you drop low on HP, stuff like Sparkling Drift Globe Core. With a haste buff and bronze call to action, you have some offensive powers as well. The spread in offensive and defensive is even, and it might come down to how you want to use your File of Serenity when choosing the Kyrian Covenant. The Necrolords have some neat passives as well, too many to get into. The most impactful from Marilith, the first Soulbind you get, is Ultimate Form that makes you immune to CC while you have Fleshcraft on you. Although this is also the legendary effect you saw earlier, being able to go into a pack with a big ass shield and immune to CC might offset some of the bear weaknesses. Very few at the moment, to be honest. Emony looks like a pretty bear focused Soulbind with his magnificent skin that builds up to give you a potential 100% uptime, 20% HP increase buff. That's pretty cool, and when you pair it with his ultimate trait, the Runescribed Bone, you get an AoE damage component as well. Heimrir has a few out-of-place options that take you away from the tanking conduits route, with his last trait being Forgeborn Reveries. When you die, your armor continues to fight for 10 seconds, dealing 50% less damage and healing, and you cannot be healed instead, because you are actually controlling the armor. This is a fancy way of saying that as a chi death, you get to live for 10 more seconds and deal less damage. This can actually be pretty good for a tank and progression type content. The Night Fae will give you Nia as your first Soulbind, and with a few DPS and haste options here and there, you will end up with Grove Invigoration that gives you a 5-minute mastery buff which decays over time. The buff activates when you pop Convoke the Spirit, so essentially you can have it 100% of the time on you. Dreamweaver seems like a cooler Soulbind where you have one trait called Social Butterfly. Why? Anyway, this gives you a versatility buff when you have 2 allies next to you for a few seconds, then this buff will keep jumping between them and you for as long as you are together. Like a tight-knit group of friends that share happiness and joy. Isn't that nice? Bet the bitches love this shit. You also get Pod Tender as a cheat death mechanic that heals you for 30% of your max HP, but kills you if you take 10k damage during those 10 seconds of the hot. This is sketchy. The effect is great for a tank if you can prevent that 10k damage, of course. Korain might not have the best tank ability as his last trait, but has 2 interesting ones on opposing trees. Face Your Foes makes you take less damage when you are in front of your enemy, so clearly a tank trait. Hold the Line gives you 10% physical damage reduction if you sit still for more than 5 seconds. Again, clearly tank traits, although placed on routes with potency and finesse conduits that offer no tankiness of themselves. Similar to the Covenant class ability, the Venthyr have more offensive Soulbinds. Nadia at least increases your damage through various means, with the Thrill Seeker trait being maybe one of the most impactful ones so far. Being in combat gives you a stacking buff that culminates at 40 stacks and speeds up everything you do by 20% for 10 seconds. Think of it as a mini Bloodlust. Theotar has some hilarious traits, some that are actually pretty good. Wasteland Propriety transforms Ravenous Frenzy to also give you a 10% versatility and 4% to your allies for 10 seconds buff. Again, versatility is one of the main stats for bears and has been for some years now. However, for the most tankiness, General Draven seems to be the best choice. With 3 endurance conduits available, it also has stuff like Hold Your Ground. Standing still for 4 seconds increases your stamina by 10% and 4% healing done, aka Frenzy Regen. If you move, you keep the buff for 4 more seconds. Maintaining this seems like an interesting mechanic to juggle. The last trait, Service in Stone, is similar to the Blood Decay talent. When below 40% HP, you take 10% reduced damage. That's pretty strong, although as a bear you won't usually stay that low for a long time. And this just in, conduits have been released just before we got the video done. Not surprised. Right now we don't have character templates to test them outside leveling from 50 to 60, but you can at least hear some impressions, right? The potency ones for Guardian, which are focused on damage output, are 2 at the moment. One of them gives you 10% haste during Berserk. You already saw how much power we can pump into one cooldown. 10% haste is very nice, but it feels like putting all your eggs into one basket. One Berserk basket. Another conduit makes Mangle increase the damage of your next Maul by 10%, stacking 3 times. I had a whole speech ready for how Maul seems meh, and how there are situations when you have a lot of rage and iron furring some more is just overkill. Not to mention rage should ideally give you the option to spend it on either mitigation or damage. Choice is always nice. The endurance options so far too are a bit average and things we may have seen before. Dropping below 25% HP makes you cast a Frenzy Regen with an internal cooldown of 90 seconds, while another conduit is the Azurite trait Layered Maid, giving Iron Fur an 8% chance to apply 2 stacks instead of 1. Another endurance option, General 1, reduces the cooldown of Barkskin by 10%, and that seems pretty nice with all the things we've seen about Barkskin. But overall they are a bit on the average side. Granted, all of these are scalable up to rank 15, so the power gain will be higher later on. Bears are shaping up to be one of the strongest tanks, at least on paper. The customization options with the Soulbinds seem to be way cooler for non-DPS specs, and I know I am super hyped to claw my way to the top. You barely escaped the puns. You thought you did, but in the end, I still wrote the script. For your information though, I did sync them all at the end as a little cherry on top, as thanks for watching the whole video. Keep your eyes peeled in the Dream Grove Discord community for Pump's article on bears that should come out once we have conduits to test properly, and even more bear updates. And of course, thank you to our patrons for supporting all of this content. We do these class videos twice per week, plus the news show. And of course, recently we started the podcast and you are supporting that as well. And if you haven't checked either of these, the Patreon link is down below and you'll bound to find probably 3 podcast episodes by the time this video goes live. Thank you for all of that. And thank you for watching the video. Hope you find it useful and we'll see you in the next one.